I came back from the funeral, my heart racing, with a bittersweet kind of excitement. I was going to tell my son and daughter-in-law that my dad had just left me 3 massive profitable farms and a beautiful house by the sea. I thought it would solve all their financial worries, but as I stood outside their heavy oak door, I heard their voices, and what I heard next absolutely froze my blood. Before I tell you the rest of this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who mistook your generosity for weakness. My name is Victor Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and for 40 of those years, I ran a heavy machinery contracting business out in the brutal Texas heat. I spent my life moving dirt, pouring concrete, and building solid foundations so my family would never have to struggle the way I did growing up. When my wife Barbara passed away 5 years ago, my world went completely dark. The silence of our empty home became unbearable, and I thought I needed to be closer to my only son, Derek. Derek is 45 now, a middle management executive who always wears expensive tailored suits to cover up the fact that his career is stagnant and he is drowning in fake prestige. 3 years ago, Derek and his wife Monica decided they desperately needed to buy a massive upscale mansion in a gated Dallas neighborhood to impress their friends. They could not afford it. The banks laughed at their debt-to-income ratio. So I stepped in. I paid 80% of the purchase price in cold, hard cash. That was $1.2 million directly out of my retirement fund. I let Derek put the deed solely in his name. I told myself it was for his pride to let him feel like the man of the house. I took the attached-in-law suite in the back, thinking I would spend my twilight years surrounded by family, watching my 6-year-old grandson Tommy grow up. I thought I was buying family unity. That was my first and biggest mistake. I had just flown back to Dallas from rural Pennsylvania. I was completely exhausted physically and emotionally drained from burying my father George. He lived to be 95. He was a tough, quiet man who never threw away a single dollar. We always thought he was just scraping by on a modest pension. But the estate lawyer had pulled me aside after the service and handed me a thick leather folder. My father had secretly owned 3 highly profitable agricultural farms and a stunning coastal property down in Naples, Florida. Decades of accumulated wealth. And he left every single piece of it to me. I was standing on this porch of the Dallas house holding my suitcase in one hand and that leather folder in the other. I was actually smiling despite my grief. I thought to myself, Derek has been so stressed about money lately. This inheritance is going to change everything for them. I reached out to turn the brass handle of the front door, but the door was slightly ajar, maybe caught on the latch. As I pushed it open an inch, Monica's voice echoed from the living room. She was practically screaming but keeping her volume just low enough so the neighbors would not hear. "I cannot take it anymore, Derek," she hissed. "You need to get him out of here. He ruins the entire aesthetic of this house. His dusty boots track dirt everywhere, and that in-law suite constantly smells like old man and cheap coffee. I want him gone." I froze in my tracks. My own daughter-in-law, a 38-year-old woman whose luxury lifestyle I heavily subsidized, was talking about me like I was a stray dog that had wandered into her pristine living room. I held my breath, waiting for my son to defend me. I waited for Derek to remind his wife that the very floor she was standing on was paid for by my sweat and blood. Instead, Derek let out a heavy, irritated sigh. "Monica, calm down," he said, his voice dripping with a cold, calculated tone I had never heard from him before. "I am handling it. You just need to be patient for a few more days." "Patient," Monica snapped. "I want him in Shady Pines by the end of the month. I already looked it up online. It is a state-run facility cheap enough that we will not have to waste our own money on him. Just dump him there and be done with it." Shady Pines. I knew that place well. It was a notoriously underfunded, miserable facility where the elderly were sent by families who simply wanted to forget them. My stomach churned violently. Surely Derek would say no. Surely my son would never agree to lock his own father away in a place like that. I told you I have the plan ready, Derek replied, lowering his voice, though I could hear every single word clearly through the crack in the door. He is grieving right now. He is completely emotionally compromised from the funeral. It is the perfect timing. I already had my lawyer draft the power of attorney, and I spoke to Dr. Evans. He is willing to sign a document stating that the trauma of losing Grandpa has caused a rapid cognitive decline. We are going to declare him mentally unfit. I felt the blood physically drain from my face. My fingers gripped the handle of my suitcase so tight, my knuckles turned stark white. Derek continued completely oblivious to the fact that his father was standing just 3 feet away on the porch, listening to his own execution. Once I get him to sign that power of attorney, Derek said, I will have total legal control over his remaining savings. We dump him in Shady Pines, I drain his accounts, and I can finally pay off those margin calls from the crypto crash. If I don't get that money by next week, the bank is going to come after everything we own. We just need to play the grieving, supportive family for a few more days until his signature is on that paper. The silence that followed hit me harder than a physical blow to the chest. They were not just ungrateful children. They were predators. My son, my own flesh and blood, had just admitted to a premeditated plan to strip away my basic human rights, lock me in a rundown institution, and steal the rest of my money to cover his own pathetic financial mistakes, all while pretending to comfort me over the death of my father. My hand slowly dropped from the brass doorknob. The profound, aching grief I had been carrying all day for my dad simply evaporated. It vanished into thin air, instantly replaced by a cold, apocalyptic fury. I had spent 40 years running heavy machinery. I knew exactly how to build things up, but more importantly, I knew exactly how to tear things down. I looked down at the leather folder in my hand, containing millions of dollars in generational wealth. They had no idea this existed. They thought I was just a tired, vulnerable old man with a modest bank account left to drain. They thought they held all the cards. I did not burst through the door. I did not yell or scream or demand answers. That is what a victim does. And Victor Caldwell has never been a victim. Instead, I took a step back. I carefully pulled the door shut until it clicked softly, securing the latch. I needed a moment to gather myself. I needed them to believe their sick little lie was working. If Derek and Monica wanted to play a game of ruthless deception, they were about to learn a very hard lesson. You never back a contractor into a corner because we always know where the structural weaknesses of your life are hidden. I took a deep breath, plastered a weary, grief-stricken expression onto my face, and prepared to walk into the viper's nest. I took a slow step back off the shaded porch, my leather work boots scraping against the concrete. The afternoon heat was sweltering, but the chill running down my spine had nothing to do with the weather. I waited exactly 3 seconds to let the air settle. Then I grabbed the brass handle, turned it firmly, and shoved the oak door open with enough force to make it rattle on its hinges. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind me, allowing it to slam with a loud thud that echoed sharply through the cavernous foyer of the mansion my money built. The frantic screaming match radiating from the living room died instantly. It was as if someone had abruptly pulled the plug on a blaring radio. The silence that rushed in to fill the sprawling house was suffocating. I stood alone in the entryway, letting my broad shoulders slump forward and forcing my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let the physical exhaustion of the flight, combined with the crushing weight of my 70 years, settle deeply into my bones. I had spent 4 decades wrestling massive steel excavators and pouring concrete foundations. I knew how to endure pain, and right now I was preparing to play the role of the broken old man they needed me to be. Hurried footsteps padded quickly across the hardwood floor. Derek and Monica appeared from the grand archway of the living room, their faces hastily rearranged into masks of profound tragic sympathy. Their performance was remarkable, polished enough to fool anyone who had not just listened to them plot a hostile takeover of my life. Monica rushed forward first, her arms outstretched, her eyes wide and brimming with perfectly manufactured tears. She threw her arms around my neck and pulled me into a tight embrace. As she pressed her cheek against mine, the overwhelming scent of her designer perfume filled my lungs. I recognized the floral fragrance instantly. It was an exclusive import, a ridiculous luxury she had charged to my platinum credit card just 2 weeks prior. Now the cloying scent of that stolen luxury made my stomach turn. Derek stepped up right behind her, placing a supposedly comforting hand onto my shoulder. His eyes were red-rimmed, mimicking the look of a devastated son mourning alongside his father. He gently squeezed my shoulder, his voice thick with a fake trembling emotion that made me want to push him through the nearest wall. He told me how glad they were that I was finally home, and how worried sick they had been about me making that difficult journey all by myself. He gently guided me away from the foyer, pulling me toward the sprawling living room. I shuffled my boots against the floorboards, deliberately letting him support a large portion of my body weight, acting as though my legs could barely manage the effort. I sank deeply into the plush leather sofa, letting out a long, shaky breath that spoke of pure exhaustion. I looked around the room, taking in the vaulted ceilings, the expensive artwork, and the custom furniture. I had paid for every single inch of this comfort, yet I felt like a stranger in enemy territory. Monica hovered nervously nearby, wringing her manicured hands in a theatrical display of daughterly concern. She leaned over me, using that sweet tone she reserved for when she wanted to extract a favor. She murmured that she was going to brew me a fresh pot of herbal tea to calm my nerves, assuring me that they had everything under control and my only job now was to rest. She disappeared into the designer kitchen, her expensive heels clicking rhythmically against the imported tile. Derek sat down heavily in the matching leather armchair, directly across from me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at me with wide, sympathetic eyes. He asked me how the funeral service went, and if saying goodbye to my father had been peaceful. I nodded slowly, keeping my gaze directed down at my calloused hands. I told him it was quiet and respectful, keeping my voice low and intentionally brittle. I muttered that burying the man who raised you takes a heavy toll on a person. As I fed him those vulnerable words, my eyes scanned the surface of the modern glass coffee table situated between us. Amidst the perfectly fanned architectural magazines and polished silver coasters, a distinct anomaly caught my attention. A thick manila envelope had been hastily shoved under the edge of a glossy magazine, clearly an attempt to hide it before I walked into the room. But in his frantic rush, Derek had not pushed it far enough. The stark white corner of a legal document protruded from the open flap of the envelope. My eyesight was far sharper than I let on to my family, and even from my slouched position on the sofa, I could easily read the bold capitalized letters printed across the top of the crisp white page. Power of attorney. My pulse quickened beneath my skin, a surge of adrenaline flooding my system, but I maintained my slow breathing. They could not even wait for the dirt to settle over my father's grave before shoving their legal snare in my face. Monica returned from the kitchen. She was carrying a steaming ceramic mug of hot tea on a silver tray. She walked over and placed it gently on the glass table, setting it down right next to the poorly hidden legal document. She smiled down at me, a cold gesture devoid of any real warmth. She softly told me it was chamomile, promising it would help me sleep. She looked me right in the eyes and stated that I needed to sleep for a very long time. The sinister double meaning behind her words was obvious to me now. I reached out my right hand toward the hot mug, intentionally letting my fingers shake before I made contact with the ceramic handle. As I gripped the mug, I allowed my hand to jerk, causing the scalding tea to slosh violently over the rim. The dark amber liquid spilled across the pristine glass table, creeping rapidly toward the hidden manila envelope. Derek gasped and flinched hard, his mask of grief slipping for a second. He instinctively lunged forward to protect his precious legal trap. He ignored the hot liquid dripping dangerously close to my lap, and instead snatched the magazine and the envelope, pulling them tightly against his chest to save the paperwork from the spill. He forced a tight, nervous smile, offering to clean up the mess for me. I pulled my hand back and leaned heavily against the sofa cushions, letting my head loll slightly. I closed my eyes for a long moment, acting as if holding a cup of tea had drained my last ounce of physical strength. I needed them to believe with absolute certainty that I was nothing more than a broken, grieving, exhausted old man, clinging desperately to the shelter of his son's home. I slowly opened my eyes, blinking repeatedly, as if my vision was blurred. I raised a trembling finger, lifting my arm with agonizing slowness, and pointed directly at the envelope Derek was clutching in his lap. I kept my expression vacant, my voice dropping to a fragile, raspy whisper that barely carried across the quiet living room. Derek. What are those hospital forms? Derek froze for only a fraction of a second. I had to give him credit for his remarkable recovery. He released a long, exaggerated sigh and slowly let go of the manila envelope he was clutching against his chest. He smoothed out the wrinkled edges of the glossy magazine and looked at me with an expression of deep, manufactured sorrow. He slid closer to me on the leather sofa and gently placed his hand over mine. His palm was clammy, betraying the nervous energy he was trying so desperately to hide from me. He squeezed my fingers, staring deeply into my eyes with a look of pure, rehearsed empathy. "Dad," he said, his voice dropping an octave to sound incredibly soothing and gentle. "I did not want to show you this until you had a chance to settle in and rest. These are not hospital forms. It is a colorful brochure and some enrollment paperwork for an exclusive luxury grief retreat. Monica and I have been talking for days, and we are just so incredibly worried about your mental health after Grandpa George passed away. You have been through so much emotional trauma this week, and we truly think a few weeks at a specialized wellness center in the quiet countryside would do absolute wonders for your soul." He pointed a steady finger toward the thick legal document protruding from the envelope. "And that paper you saw, the power of attorney, it is just a simple temporary authorization form. We want you to go to this beautiful retreat and focus entirely on healing your broken heart. But while you are gone, your property taxes still need to be paid on time. Your utility bills, your insurance, and your medical premiums need to be managed without any delays. If you sign this temporary release, I can handle all the boring financial busywork for you. You will not have to worry about a single late fee or collection notice while you rest and recover. It is just a minor formality, Dad. Just us trying to take care of you for a change to repay you for everything you have done." Monica immediately stepped closer to the coffee table, picking up her dramatic cue like a seasoned stage actress. She hovered over my seated figure, her face completely transformed into a mask of sweet, daughterly devotion. She reached out and gently rubbed my tense shoulder, her heavy, expensive perfume washing over my senses once again. "Derek is absolutely right, Victor," she murmured, using the soft, cooing voice she usually reserved for speaking to a tiny toddler. "You have spent your entire life taking care of everyone else in this family. You worked yourself to the absolute bone running that exhausting, heavy machinery business in the brutal Texas heat. It is finally time you step back and let us carry the heavy lifting for a while. We just want to see you healthy, relaxed, and happy again." She leaned down gracefully and picked up the ceramic mug from the glass table, the exact one she had poured for me moments earlier. The hot tea was still steaming visibly, releasing a remarkably strong, earthy aroma of crushed chamomile and something else faintly bitter into the air. She pressed the warm mug firmly into my trembling hands, making sure I had a solid grip on the handle. "Please just drink your tea while it is hot," she urged gently. "It will calm your frayed nerves and help you get some desperately needed sleep. You look so incredibly pale," Victor, completely exhausted from the travel. "We can talk about the wellness retreat and all the boring paperwork tomorrow morning, right after you have had a wonderfully long, peaceful night of uninterrupted rest. There is absolutely no rush to do this tonight. Just drink this warm tea down and go get some sleep in your comfortable bed. You are safe here with us." I kept my head bowed low, staring intently into the dark amber liquid swirling inside the ceramic mug. Underneath my fragile facade of a broken, grieving, and exhausted old man, my mind was racing forward with absolute terrifying clarity. I forcefully suppressed a cold, bitter smirk from fully forming on my lips. I had spent 40 long years surviving in the grueling construction industry. I had aggressively negotiated with cutthroat contractors, outsmarted ruthless union bosses, and dealt with slimy real estate developers who would warmly smile right in your face while actively trying to pick your back pocket. I knew exactly what a desperate financial hustle looked like. I knew the specific cadence of a practiced lie, the obvious overcompensation in the comforting tone of a voice, and the subtle physical tells of a con artist trying frantically to close a terrible deal. Derek and Monica were pathetic amateurs compared to the corporate sharks I used to dismantle on a daily basis. Yet, they truly believed I was just a naive, slow-witted senior citizen who was ready to blindly sign away his entire life out of sheer emotional exhaustion. I knew with absolute, undeniable, total certainty that if I ever actually put my signature on that legal paper, I would be immediately stripped of my financial assets, thrown into the absolute cheapest state-run nursing home they could locate, and left to rot in a dark room while they gleefully squandered my hard-earned retirement money. But I also knew I could not blow up and confront them right now. I was alone, outnumbered in their territory, and I needed absolute, undeniable proof of their malicious intentions before I dropped the proverbial hammer on their perfect little lives. I desperately needed to continue playing this incredibly pathetic game. I slowly raised my free, empty hand and rubbed my eyes vigorously, letting out a prolonged, incredibly shaky groan. I purposefully slouched much deeper into the plush sofa cushions, letting my heavy head drop back against the cool leather. I squinted across the table at Derek, blinking rapidly, as if my vision was swimming uncontrollably. "Derek, my boy," I whispered loudly, intentionally, letting my vocal cords crack with a manufactured frailty. My eyes are so incredibly blurry right now. I cannot even read the large print on that glossy magazine cover, let alone decipher a dense legal contract. My head is pounding fiercely, and my chest feels painfully heavy with grief. You are a good, responsible son to worry about my complicated bills, but I simply do not have the physical strength to look at any official paperwork tonight. My tired brain is too foggy from the long flights and the emotional toll of the funeral. I need to lie down immediately before I collapse right here in your living room. Derek and Monica quickly exchanged a swift, highly meaningful glance. It was a calculating look of slight frustration, perfectly mixed with eager anticipation. "That is perfectly okay, Dad," Derek said quickly, gently patting my knee to reassure me. "The paperwork is not going anywhere." I muttered a quiet, defeated goodnight to them both. I finally reached the heavy wooden door of my private guest bedroom suite, stepped inside the dark room, and slowly turned the solid deadbolt. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a satisfying metallic thud, sealing me inside the quiet sanctuary of my in-law suite. I stood perfectly still in the center of the dimly lit room, the only illumination bleeding through the slatted window blinds from the streetlights outside. In my hands, the ceramic mug radiated a fierce heat against my palms. A thick plume of steam twisted upward, carrying that pungent, earthy aroma of chamomile masked by a sharply bitter chemical undertone. I lowered my gaze, staring deeply into the dark, swirling liquid. My heart was still hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs, a primal response to the sheer, terrifying audacity of the conversation I had just witnessed. They wanted me declared legally incompetent. They needed a doctor to swear under oath that my mind was rapidly deteriorating. And suddenly, a cold, sickening realization began to unfurl in the back of my brain. I carried the mug over to the small, polished mahogany desk sitting near the window and gently set it down. I sank heavily into the padded desk chair and stared at my own hands. I held them out flat in front of my chest, suspending them in the cool air of the bedroom. They were perfectly steady. The thick, calloused fingers that had operated massive hydraulic cranes for 4 decades did not waver an inch. But that had not been the case yesterday, or the day before that, or the terrible day before that. Over the past 3 weeks, my mornings had been a terrifying nightmare, I woke up with a suffocating fog blanketing my brain. I would stumble out of bed, my equilibrium shattered, feeling as though the floor was shifting. My thoughts would swim sluggishly, thick and uncoordinated, making it difficult to remember simple words. And the tremors, the awful, humiliating tremors. My hands shook so violently during breakfast that I could barely hold a fork. Derek had been right there every single morning, watching me struggle with an expression of profound theatrical pity. He gently took the utensils from my vibrating hands, speaking in that condescending voice he reserved for absolute invalids. He told me it was the inevitable decay of natural aging. He insisted my grief was accelerating a dormant neurological condition, hinting my mind was slipping into the dark abyss of dementia. The most terrifying part was that I genuinely started to believe his vicious lies. I wept alone in this very room, terrified. My sharp mind was failing me at the exact moment I needed it most. But now, sitting in the dark, the pieces of their sinister puzzle snapped violently into place. The morning tremors only ever happened after I drank Monica's special bedtime tea. She started this nightly ritual exactly 3 weeks ago, insisting the herbal blend was a holistic remedy to help me bravely cope with my beloved elderly father's tragically failing overall health. I looked at the steaming ceramic mug resting on the mahogany desk. It was a potent chemical cocktail carefully designed to slowly destroy my nervous system. My gut instinct, honed by decades of navigating treacherous business negotiations, screamed at me with absolute clarity. I stood up, grabbing the handle of the mug with a firm, unwavering grip. I walked over to the large Boston fern situated in the corner of the suite. It was a houseplant Barbara gifted me before she passed away. The vibrant green fronds cascaded elegantly over the edges of a terracotta pot. Without a single moment of hesitation, I tilted the ceramic mug and poured the toxic contents directly into the dark soil at the base of the fern. The hot liquid soaked instantly into the dirt, releasing a bitter cloud of steam into the bedroom. I carried the empty mug into the attached bathroom, turned on the cold water faucet, and thoroughly rinsed away any lingering residue, ensuring no physical trace of the poisoned tea remained. I dried it carefully with a hand towel and placed it gently on the marble counter. Then I walked back into the bedroom, pulled back the heavy comforter, and climbed into bed. For the first time in a month, my mind was not clouded by drug-induced fatigue. I lay awake for hours, staring up at the dark ceiling, methodically mapping out the brutal retaliation I was going to unleash upon my son. When the sun broke through the window blinds, casting bright streaks across the bedroom floor, I sat up. I swung my legs over the mattress and planted my bare feet firmly against the cold hardwood. I waited for the familiar rush of vertigo to hit me. I waited for the room to spin, for the suffocating brain fog to descend, for the terrifying weakness to buckle my knees. Nothing happened. I stood up straight. My balance was perfect. I took a deep breath, feeling a surge of raw vitality coursing through my veins. My mind was razor-sharp, processing thoughts with the calculating efficiency I relied on my entire professional life. I held my hands out in front of me, spreading my fingers wide. They were completely motionless, steady as a rock. The stark contrast between this morning and the previous 3 weeks hit me with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The irrefutable proof was standing right in front of me. Derek and Monica were not merely gaslighting my reality. They were not just manipulating my grief to steal my retirement savings. They were actively and maliciously drugging me in my own home. They were secretly feeding me powerful tranquilizers to manufacture a fake medical history, aiming to turn me into a trembling vegetable so a doctor could declare me incompetent. It was an assault on my bodily autonomy executed by the people I sacrificed everything to protect. I walked across the room to retrieve my heavy silver watch from the mahogany desk. As I turned toward the bedroom door, my eyes fell upon the large Boston fern resting in the corner. I stepped closer, my breath catching slightly in my throat. Just yesterday afternoon, the sprawling fronds had been a vibrant, healthy shade of bright emerald green. Now the entire bottom section of the plant, exactly where I had poured Monica's special herbal tea the night before, was completely and irreparably withered. The once healthy leaves had turned a sickly, brittle yellow color, rapidly curling inward and dying from the harsh, toxic chemicals soaking the soil. I stood in the silence of my room and stared intensely at the rapidly decaying plant, a profound, icy chill creeping slowly down my spine. I was sleeping under the exact same roof as my potential murderers. Every single meal they served me, every fake smile they offered, every hollow word of comfort they spoke, was deeply laced with a lethal dose of pure greed. I was no longer a beloved father to them. I was simply their targeted prey. They had entirely discarded our sacred family bond for the promise of dirty money. I knew in that exact moment, without any shadow of a doubt, that I would show them absolutely no mercy. My vengeance would be swift, permanent, and utterly devastating to their entire pathetic little world. I spent the morning moving through the house like a ghost. I needed to thoroughly map out the exact dimensions of their deceit before I swung the heavy wrecking ball into their foundation. My first objective was securing my communication lines. If they were brazen enough to slip dangerous tranquilizers into my evening chamomile tea, they were certainly bold enough to systematically isolate me from the outside world. I reached into the front pocket of my denim jacket, the one I had worn on the flight back from Pennsylvania, to retrieve my heavy brass keychain. I always kept the small silver mailbox key threaded securely onto the secondary ring, right between the ignition key to my vintage Ford truck and the heavy deadbolt key for the in-law suite. I ran my calloused thumb over the jagged edges of the metal keys. The silver mailbox key was gone. The small metal ring it had been securely attached to was entirely bent out of shape, clearly indicating that someone had hastily and forcefully pried it off. A cold wave of absolute clarity washed over me. I had slept incredibly heavily during those first 2 nights immediately after the funeral, completely knocked unconscious by the toxic dosage Monica had forced upon my grieving body. They had walked into my private room while I was incapacitated, dug ruthlessly through my personal pockets, and stolen my direct access to the community mailbox located at the far end of our gated street. There was only one logical, terrifying reason why Derek and Monica would care so deeply about my incoming residential mail. The estate lawyer back in Pennsylvania had explicitly told me he would be sending the formal certified copies of my father's last will and testament directly to my Dallas residence for my immediate review. Those thick sealed envelopes contained the official property deeds, the tax transfer forms, and the certified ownership documents for the 3 sprawling agricultural farms and the magnificent coastal property down in Naples, Florida. By deliberately stealing my mailbox key, Derek had effectively intercepted an absolute fortune in generational wealth. He now possessed the physical, undeniable documents, proving that my late father had bypassed him entirely and left a multi-million-dollar real estate empire directly in my hands. That explained Derek's desperate, frantic rush to get me to sign that fraudulent power of attorney the previous afternoon. He knew exactly what those vast properties were currently worth on the open market. If he could legally seize total control of my personal finances before I fully realized the immense value of my inheritance, he could easily and swiftly liquidate the Pennsylvania farms and the beautiful Florida beach house to completely cover his massive cryptocurrency debts. He was intentionally keeping me completely in the dark, treating me like a senile prisoner in my own home, while he quietly and methodically prepared to auction off my family legacy to the highest bidder. I spent the rest of the long afternoon securely locked inside my private suite, carefully avoiding any accidental interaction with them. As the hot Texas sun finally began to dip below the distant horizon, the atmosphere in the main house shifted dramatically. Monica was loudly preparing to host one of her lavish, expensive dinner parties. She absolutely loved to parade her fabricated debt-fueled wealth in front of her superficial, status-obsessed influencer friends. I could clearly hear the expensive catering crew arriving through the back service entrance, the sharp clinking of fine crystal wine glasses, and the loud bursts of forced fake laughter echoing down the long hardwood hallway. I sat completely still in the dark, listening intently to the rhythmic thumping bass radiating from their high-end custom-installed sound system. They were joyfully celebrating their perceived victory. They were eating imported luxury caviar and drinking expensive vintage champagne, fully believing they had successfully conquered the elderly obstacle currently living quietly in their backyard. I waited patiently until the boisterous party reached its peak volume. The loud, chaotic chatter and pulsing electronic music provided the perfect auditory cover for my stealthy movements. I slipped out of my suite, moving with the silent, deliberate grace of a man who had spent his youth quietly hunting in the dense Appalachian woods. I needed a simple glass of cold water, but more importantly, I desperately needed to observe the enemy in their natural, unguarded habitat. I crept silently down the dimly lit hallway, stopping just short of the grand, sweeping archway that led directly into the massive marble-countered designer kitchen. The room was brightly illuminated by modern pendant lights, and the rich smell of roasted garlic and expensive truffles hung heavily in the air. Monica was standing casually near the imported double-door refrigerator, confidently holding a half-empty glass of sparkling wine. She was closely surrounded by three of her closest friends' women who perfectly mirrored her exact style of aggressive, manicured, superficial perfection. I pressed my back completely flat against the cool drywall, remaining entirely hidden by the deep protective shadows of the long hallway, and listened. The women were gossiping loudly, their shrill voices carrying easily over the ambient background noise of the festive party. One of them curiously asked Monica exactly how she was handling the tremendous emotional stress of having me living in the house immediately after the tragic funeral. Monica let out a sharp, incredibly cruel laugh that sounded exactly like shattering glass. "Oh, it is an absolute living nightmare," she declared, proudly taking a generous sip of her expensive wine. "I swear, dealing with him is vastly worse than dealing with a stubborn, hyperactive toddler. You have absolutely no idea what Derek and I have to put up with on a daily basis. The pathetic old man is completely losing his mind right before our eyes. He shakes constantly, he forgets absolutely everything, and he just sits there staring blankly at the walls. I literally have to blend his heavy medication directly into his bedtime tea every single night just to keep him manageable and quiet. He is practically a useless vegetable now, but once the legal paperwork finally goes through next week, we are finally moving him to a cheap state facility and reclaiming our beautiful space." I stood absolutely motionless in the dark hallway. Hearing the raw, unfiltered malice vibrating in her voice confirmed every dark, terrifying suspicion I harbored. She was not just financially greedy, she was fundamentally, irreversibly evil. She viewed my manufactured suffering as a highly convenient punchline for her glamorous cocktail party anecdotes. I did not need to hear another single word. I slowly backed away from the grand archway, turning around and walking silently back down the long corridor toward my locked suite. The initial paralyzing shock of their brutal betrayal had completely vanished quickly, replaced by a profound, terrifying, and calculated calm. The heavy work gloves were officially off. I was no longer going to play weak defense against my own son and his toxic, venomous wife. I was not just going to legally protect myself from their pathetic, desperate schemes. I was going to systematically, ruthlessly, and entirely dismantle their entire pathetic little lives. I walked back into my suite and locked the door, sliding the heavy deadbolt firmly into place. The stifling fog that had plagued my mind for the past 3 weeks was completely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp clarity. I knelt beside my heavy oak wardrobe and reached underneath the bottom drawer, feeling for the false panel I had installed shortly after moving in. I pulled out a sleek black laptop. It was a secure machine I bought with cash months ago, completely disconnected from the main house network. I never trusted Derek with my digital privacy, and right now, that mild paranoia was about to save my life. I booted up the computer and connected to a secure mobile hotspot on my burner phone, ensuring my digital footprint was completely invisible to whatever monitoring software my son might have installed on the local router. I opened my password manager and logged into my banking portal. The large balances in my primary retirement accounts were still intact, sitting exactly where I had left them. Derek had not made his major move yet. He was clearly waiting for that fraudulent power of attorney to be fully executed before he attempted to drain the massive funds. But my 40 years in the heavy machinery business had taught me a very important lesson. When you are looking for a leak in a hydraulic system, you do not look at the giant holding tank. You look closely at the tiny high-pressure valves. I pulled the detailed transaction history for my everyday checking and secondary savings accounts, narrowing the search parameters to the exact time frame when my sudden, mysterious morning tremors had first begun. I slowly scrolled through the endless rows of digital data, my eyes scanning the mundane purchases. Groceries, pharmacy runs, minor utility bills. Everything looked normal on the surface. But then a subtle pattern began to emerge from the digital noise. Small erratic withdrawals were buried deep between the legitimate transactions. $400 here, $800 there. A random transfer for $1,500 right after midnight. They were automated clearinghouse transactions funneled directly into a single obscure corporate entity listed simply as Apex Holdings LLC. I felt a bitter smile pull at the corners of my mouth. Derek was aggressively testing the perimeter fences. He was siphoning off microscopic fractions of my wealth, intentionally keeping the amounts low enough to avoid triggering automated fraud alerts. He honestly believed my brain was so deeply clouded by his toxic chamomile tea that I would never notice a few $1,000s missing from my monthly ledger. He was quietly bleeding me dry to fund his lifestyle while preparing for the final lethal blow. I did not waste a single second raging at the screen. I closed the banking portal, picked up my burner phone, and dialed a number I had memorized over 30 years ago. I needed a predator, and there was no one more vicious in the great state of Texas than Mitchell Harding. Mitchell was a cutthroat old-school civil attorney who had successfully helped me crush 3 corrupt rival union bosses back in the turbulent 90s. He was a ruthless legal bulldog who operated with cold, calculated precision, and he was fiercely loyal. He answered on the second ring, his deep, gravelly voice barking his last name through the receiver. I bypassed pleasantries. "Mitchell, it is Victor Caldwell," I said, keeping my tone completely flat and strictly professional. "I need you to drop whatever trivial corporate mess you are currently handling and open a secure file for me immediately." There was a brief pause on the line before Mitchell chuckled, the low sound vibrating through the speaker. "Victor, you old stubborn mule," he replied instantly, recognizing the dangerous tone in my voice. "I have not heard you sound this completely ready for war since we dismantled that steel syndicate in '98. Tell me exactly who we are destroying today." "My own son," I replied coldly. The levity instantly vanished from Mitchell's end of the line. I meticulously briefed him on the entire situation. I detailed the intercepted legal mail regarding my late father's sprawling Pennsylvania farms. I explained the highly toxic tranquilizers Monica was secretly slipping into my evening beverages. I told him about the fraudulent power of attorney Derek, tried to force upon me just a few hours prior. Finally, I gave him the exact routing numbers and the corporate name of the shadow entity, Apex Holdings LLC, that was currently draining my personal checking accounts. "I need you to completely bypass the standard channels, Mitchell," I instructed firmly. "I want you to run a deep, aggressive background check on that specific LLC. I need to know exactly who registered it, where the money is flowing, and what it is being used for. Furthermore, I want you to pull the master property deed and the entire financial history for the Dallas mansion I am currently living in. I paid 80% of that property in cash 4 years ago, but I need to know exactly what Derek has been doing with his portion of the equity." "Consider it done, Victor," Mitchell responded, his voice adopting a deadly serious professional cadence. "I will put my best forensic accountants on this immediately. Give me 2 hours to rip into these financial records. Do not sign anything, do not confront them, and do not drink another drop of water in that house unless you poured it yourself. I will call you back on this exact number the second I have the data." The line went dead. I placed the burner phone on the mahogany desk and leaned back in my chair. The next 2 hours moved with agonizing slowness. I sat in the dim light of my room listening to the muffled sounds of Monica's lavish dinner party, continuing to rage on the other side of the walls. I heard the loud clinking of expensive crystal and the booming bass of their music. They were drinking expensive wine paid for with my stolen money, laughing at my perceived weakness. I channeled every ounce of my frustration into a silent, burning resolve. I was going to strip them down to the absolute studs. Exactly 1 hour and 58 minutes later, the burner phone vibrated. I answered immediately. "Tell me what you found." "Mitchell," I demanded. "Victor." "You were right." Mitchell began, his tone grim. "Apex Holdings, LLC, is a dummy corporation registered to an offshore cryptocurrency exchange. Derek has been funneling your stolen cash directly into highly volatile digital assets. Based on the market crash, he lost nearly every penny." "That explains his desperate rush for the Pennsylvania farms," I murmured. "It is vastly worse than that," Victor Mitchell interrupted. "The offshore accounts are only a fraction of this disaster." I pulled the property records for the Dallas mansion and looked at the current banking liens. My stomach tightened. "What did my son do to the house?" Mitchell took a deep breath. "Victor, we have a massive problem. They haven't just been skimming your checking account. The house is drowning in debt." I gripped the burner phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Mitchell's words echoed in the quiet space of my room. Drowning in debt. It made perfect, sickening sense now. Derek had leveraged the equity of the Dallas mansion, the home I paid for mostly in cash, to fuel his disastrous cryptocurrency gambling. He was desperate. If the bank foreclosed on this property, his entire fake wealthy lifestyle would violently shatter. He absolutely needed the enormous value of my newly inherited Pennsylvania farms and the Naples coastal house to completely erase the massive financial hole he had dug for himself. But to easily liquidate those massive assets without my direct consent, he needed me legally out of the picture. He needed a judge to look at my medical charts and declare me profoundly incompetent. I thanked Mitchell for his rapid work, strictly instructing him to prepare all necessary legal motions to freeze the assets, and I disconnected the call. The financial ruin was staggering, but I knew I could not launch my offensive based on stolen money alone. Money could be debated, hidden, or tied up in endless corporate litigation. If I confronted them now, they would simply claim I was a confused, forgetful old man who misunderstood a complex business arrangement. I desperately needed an impenetrable bulletproof vest to entirely neutralize their inevitable claims of my senility. I needed absolute, irrefutable medical proof. The following morning, I woke up early and carefully rehearsed my performance. I shuffled slowly into the designer kitchen, letting my shoulders slump heavily forward. Monica was already awake, sipping her imported espresso while scrolling mindlessly through her expensive smartphone. Derek was sitting at the massive granite island, frantically typing on his laptop, no doubt trying to artificially inflate his failing digital currency accounts. I poured myself a small glass of cold water, ensuring my hand shook just enough to spill a few drops on the pristine floor. I loudly cleared my throat, forcing my voice to sound incredibly raspy and weak. I muttered that my bedroom door hinges were squeaking terribly and giving me a headache. I told them I needed to take my vintage Ford truck down to the local hardware store to buy a small can of lubricating oil and maybe a few simple tools to keep my old hands busy. Derek barely looked up from his glowing screen, completely dismissing my trivial domestic errand. Monica simply waved her manicured hand in my general direction, condescendingly telling me to drive carefully and not to get lost on the familiar suburban streets. Their sheer arrogance was truly a magnificent gift. It blinded them to everything happening right beneath their noses. I walked out the heavy front door, slowly climbing into the driver's seat of my reliable truck. I started the roaring engine, backed out of the long driveway, and drove exactly 3 blocks before abruptly pulling into a deserted commercial parking lot. I securely locked my vehicle, walked to the nearest busy intersection, and immediately hailed a passing city cab. I was not going anywhere near a hardware store. I gave the cab driver the specific address for an exclusive, private, and highly reputable independent diagnostic clinic located entirely across town, far away from any doctors Derek or Monica might personally know or potentially influence. During the 30-minute ride, I mentally organized my thoughts, preparing to present a calm, rationale, and terrifyingly clear case to the medical professionals. I needed a doctor to look at me, test me, and officially certify that my brain was functioning with absolute perfect precision. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the immaculate medical facility, bypassing the crowded main waiting room and heading straight for the private executive consultation desk. I paid a substantial expedited fee entirely in cash, demanding a comprehensive, immediate, and utterly exhaustive series of physical and cognitive evaluations. I was quickly escorted into a sterile, brightly lit examination room where a serious middle-aged physician named Dr. Eris Thorne walked in to greet me. I did not waste his valuable time with trivial pleasantries. I looked him directly in the eyes, my voice steady and commanding, completely dropping the fragile old man routine. I told him I strongly suspected I was being intentionally and maliciously poisoned by members of my own household. I demanded a complete toxicology screening of my blood and urine, specifically looking for heavy sedatives, powerful tranquilizers, or any foreign chemical agents designed to artificially mimic the advanced stages of neurological decay. Dr. Thorne raised a concerned eyebrow, clearly taken aback by my blunt, intense delivery, but the sheer gravity of my request prompted immediate action. Nurses were swiftly brought in. They drew several vials of my blood and collected the necessary samples. Following the physical extraction, Dr. Thorne personally administered a rigorous hour-long cognitive functionality exam. He asked me complex mathematical questions, tested my short-term and long-term memory recall, and evaluated my spatial awareness and logical reasoning. I answered every single query with absolute flawless accuracy. I recounted detailed financial figures from my 40-year career, recited the specific dates of my grandfather's military service, and solved his verbal puzzles without a single second of hesitation. Dr. Thorne sat back in his chair, lowering his clipboard, his expression shifting from clinical skepticism to profound, undeniable respect. He plainly stated that my cognitive health was not just perfectly normal for a man of 70 years, but it was exceptionally sharp by any medical standard. I sat patiently in the quiet examination room for another 2 hours, while the rushed laboratory technicians processed my toxicology panels. When Dr. Thorne finally returned, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind him, his face was pale and completely devoid of any professional detachment. He held a thick stack of printed laboratory results in his trembling hands. "You were absolutely right, Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, serious whisper. "The screening found significantly elevated traces of lorazepam in your bloodstream. It is a highly potent, fast-acting prescription tranquilizer. Administered consistently in these specific concentrated dosages, it would undoubtedly cause severe lethargy, intense muscle tremors, extreme confusion, and acute memory loss. It is a textbook chemical recipe for inducing a temporary, completely artificial state of advanced dementia. If you had continued ingesting this medication, your central nervous system would have eventually collapsed. The absolute confirmation of their lethal betrayal settled into my bones like heavy, solid iron. I looked at the doctor and requested one final critical piece of documentation. I needed him to draft a comprehensive, legally binding, sworn affidavit. I needed his official medical signature on a document explicitly confirming my pristine cognitive health, detailing the flawless results of my psychological evaluation, and strictly documenting the undeniable presence of the unauthorized tranquilizer actively poisoning my bloodstream. Dr. Thorne did not hesitate for a single moment. He understood the severe legal gravity of the situation. He brought in a clinic administrator to serve as a legal witness and quickly drafted the detailed medical affidavit on the clinic's official embossed letterhead. He signed it with a heavy black pen, stamping it with his personal medical seal. I carefully folded the thick stack of laboratory results and the freshly signed, incredibly powerful sworn affidavit, sliding them securely into a sturdy leather folder I had brought with me. I thanked Dr. Thorne for his absolute discretion and his rapid professional assistance. I walked out of the quiet diagnostic clinic and stepped back into the bright, blinding afternoon sunlight. The heavy leather folder tucked securely under my arm felt like an absolute impenetrable shield of armor. My pulse was steady, my breathing was calm, and my vision for the immediate future was flawlessly clear. I was no longer a vulnerable target trapped inside a hostile environment. I was now legally and medically untouchable. I held the exact irrefutable evidence required to not only protect my massive inheritance and salvage my stolen property, but to forcefully send my treacherous daughter-in-law to a federal penitentiary for a very long time. The pathetic, cowardly game they had been playing in the dark was officially over. Now they were going to play by my rules. I stood on the bustling sidewalk outside the diagnostic clinic, the heavy leather folder pressed firmly against my ribs. The midday sun beat down on my shoulders, but the cold, calculating fury radiating through my chest kept me entirely focused. I had successfully secured my medical and legal armor. Dr. Thorne's sworn affidavit was the ultimate failsafe. But defensive maneuvers were no longer sufficient. If I was going to utterly dismantle Derek and Monica, I needed undeniable high-definition proof of their daily malicious activities. I needed to capture their treacherous conversations, their financial schemes, and their literal poisoning attempts on digital tape. I walked to the edge of the busy avenue and raised my hand hailing a passing yellow cab. I slid into the worn vinyl back seat and gave the driver an address located deep within the gritty industrial sector of downtown Dallas. It was a neighborhood filled with nondescript warehouses and obscure supply stores, far removed from the pristine, manicured lawns of my son's wealthy suburb. 30 minutes later, the cab pulled up to a bleak gray cinder block building. A faded awning above the reinforced steel door simply read, "Advanced Security and Electronics." I paid the driver in cash, stepped out onto the cracked pavement, and pushed my way inside. The interior of the shop was dimly lit, packed from floor to ceiling, with glass display cases housing specialized surveillance equipment. A young, serious-looking clerk with a shaved head stood behind the main counter, watching me with quiet, professional curiosity. I did not waste time browsing the retail shelves. I walked directly up to the glass partition and told him exactly what I needed. I demanded top-tier military-grade hidden cameras capable of recording high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. I specified that the equipment needed to operate continuously on local power sources, utilize wide-angle lenses, and stream encrypted data directly to a secure remote cloud server. I also made it absolutely clear that the lenses had to be perfectly disguised within ordinary everyday household objects. The clerk nodded silently, clearly accustomed to handling private high-stakes requests. He disappeared into a secure back room for several minutes, before returning with 3 unassuming boxes. He placed them carefully on the glass counter. The first box contained a sleek, modern air purifier. It looked identical to the expensive, high-end models currently sitting in half the rooms of my son's mansion. The clerk explained that a microscopic wide-angle lens was seamlessly integrated into the digital display panel, while the internal fan motor masked a highly sensitive omnidirectional microphone. The second and third boxes contained standard white USB wall chargers. They were fully functional charging blocks, but a pinhole camera was brilliantly embedded right between the metal prongs designed to capture sweeping views of any room while drawing continuous power directly from the electrical socket. I inspected the devices thoroughly, admiring the flawless craftsmanship. I pulled a thick roll of $100 bills from my denim jacket pocket and counted out exactly $2,000 in crisp cash. I paid the clerk, took the heavy plastic shopping bag, and walked back out into the sweltering Texas heat, leaving absolutely no digital paper trail behind me. I caught another cab back to the mansion, carefully stashing the surveillance equipment inside the large canvas tool bag I had purposefully retrieved from my vintage Ford truck earlier that morning. When I finally shuffled through the heavy mahogany front doors, I immediately dropped my shoulders, dragging my feet across the polished hardwood floors. I reverted instantly to the pathetic, broken old man they expected to see. Monica was standing in the grand foyer, frantically applying a coat of bright red lipstick while balancing a silver clutch purse on her forearm. Derek was pacing impatiently near the entryway, adjusting the expensive silk tie around his neck. They were dressed in formal evening wear, clearly preparing for a high society outing. Derek paused his nervous pacing and looked at me with an expression of mild, fleeting annoyance. He quickly masked it with a fake, patronizing smile. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "Monica and I are heading to an exclusive wine tasting event across town. We will be gone for several hours. There is some leftover chicken in the refrigerator if you get hungry. Just remember to drink your herbal tea and get some sleep. You look incredibly tired." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards. I muttered a weak, raspy acknowledgement and slowly shuffled my way down the long corridor toward my private guest suite. I closed my heavy bedroom door, locked the deadbolt, and stood in the absolute silence, waiting patiently. 5 minutes later, I heard the distinct heavy thud of the front door slamming shut, followed closely by the low, powerful rumble of Derek's expensive European sports car speeding out of the long, paved driveway. I waited an additional 10 minutes to ensure they had not forgotten anything, and returned. When the sprawling mansion remained completely quiet, I grabbed my heavy canvas tool bag and stepped out into the empty hallway. The golden opportunity had finally arrived. I moved through the massive house with the focused, methodical precision of a veteran construction foreman, analyzing the architectural layout and determining the most strategic vantage points for my newly acquired digital eyes. My first target was the sprawling, vaulted living room. This was the central hub of their daily existence, the exact location where they casually discussed their vile plans while sipping imported wine. I walked over to the modern glass coffee table, completely bypassing the perfectly fanned architectural magazines. I set up the new sleek air purifier on a prominent side table directly facing the plush leather sofa. I plugged it into the wall outlet, activated the silent filtration fan, and carefully angled the digital display panel to capture the entire seating area. The microscopic lens was utterly invisible. My second objective was the massive designer kitchen. I knew Monica spent hours leaning against the granite island, gossiping endlessly on her smartphone with her superficial friends. I located a highly visible electrical outlet positioned directly above the marble countertops. I plugged one of the modified USB wall chargers into the socket, ensuring the pinhole camera had a sweeping, unobstructed view of the entire cooking space and the attached dining area. My final and arguably most critical target was Derek's private home office. I walked down the hall and quietly opened the heavy oak door. The room was a monument to his fabricated success, filled with expensive leather furniture and massive computer monitors. This was the exact location where he was actively manufacturing the fraudulent financial documents required to systematically drain my bank accounts and illegally mortgage this entire property. I knelt beside his massive mahogany desk and located an open electrical socket perfectly positioned just above the baseboard. I plugged the second modified USB wall charger firmly into the wall. The pinhole lens was perfectly angled to capture his entire desk area, his primary computer screens, and anyone who walked through the heavy office door. I took a slow, calculated breath, satisfied with the strategic placement of every single device. I had effectively wired the entire operational core of their criminal enterprise. I returned quickly to the absolute safety of my locked guest suite and pulled the hidden black laptop from its secure location beneath the heavy oak wardrobe. I powered up the machine connected to my encrypted mobile hotspot and accessed the secure cloud server provided by the surveillance shop. A grid of 3 high-definition video feeds immediately popped onto my glowing screen. The visual clarity was absolutely stunning. I could clearly see the empty leather sofa in the living room, the pristine granite countertops in the kitchen, and the massive mahogany desk in Derek's office. The wide-angle lenses captured every single critical detail with terrifying, uncompromising precision. But video alone was not going to send them to a federal penitentiary. I needed their own toxic words to seal their ultimate fate. I clicked the small audio icon on the digital dashboard, activating the highly sensitive omnidirectional microphones embedded deep within the hidden cameras. I tapped a wooden pencil gently against the surface of my desk, listening intently. A fraction of a second later, the sharp, rhythmic tapping sound echoed back through the laptop speakers with absolute crystal-clear fidelity. The audio quality was phenomenal, capable of picking up a mere whisper from across a massive room. I leaned back heavily in my padded chair and stared at the 3 glowing video feeds illuminating the dark bedroom. My heart pumped a steady, powerful rhythm. The technological snare was perfectly laid. Every corner of their glamorous, debt-fueled sanctuary was now under my total, uncompromising surveillance. I had transformed their massive luxury mansion into a giant digital rat trap. I closed the secure laptop and slid it back into its hidden compartment. I lay down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling with a cold, unforgiving smile slowly spreading across my face. The invisible snare was finally set. Now I just needed the greedy, pathetic rats to confidently walk inside and take the bait. The morning sun cast long, deceptive shadows across the pristine driveway as I quietly slipped out of the side door. I had spent the entire night watching the digital feeds on my hidden laptop, listening to the crystal-clear audio of Derek and Monica returning from their wine tasting. They had stumbled into the house laughing loudly, completely oblivious to the silent digital sentinels recording their every move. I did not wait for them to wake up and resume their pathetic, condescending performance. I had an urgent appointment across town, and I needed to be entirely off the property before their drug-induced hangovers wore off. I climbed into my vintage truck, the heavy engine roaring to life, and drove away from the suffocating confines of my own hijacked mansion. I navigated the busy morning traffic with a clear, singular purpose. My destination was a rundown, dimly lit diner located on the industrial outskirts of the city, a place where the coffee was bitter, the booths were wrapped in cracked red vinyl, and nobody asked any questions. It was the exact type of establishment Mitchell Harding preferred for his sensitive, off-the-books meetings. I parked in the back lot and walked through the heavy glass doors. The air smelled of stale grease and strong bleach. Mitchell was already sitting in a secluded corner booth facing the entrance. He wore a sharp charcoal gray suit that looked entirely out of place against the peeling wallpaper. His imposing frame took up most of the space, and his piercing, predatory eyes locked onto me the second I walked into the room. He did not smile. He simply tapped a thick manila folder resting on the scratched Formica table. I slid into the booth opposite him, keeping my posture rigid and my expression completely blank. A tired waitress approached, silently filled my thick ceramic mug with steaming black coffee, and walked away without uttering a single word. Mitchell waited until she was entirely out of earshot before he finally spoke. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that barely carried over the hum of the overhead ceiling fans. He pushed the heavy folder across the table, his thick fingers drumming a slow, methodical rhythm against the worn cardboard. I opened the folder, my eyes immediately dropping to the dense printed spreadsheets and official banking records inside. I had spent 4 decades analyzing complex construction budgets, deciphering opaque union contracts, and managing massive corporate ledgers. It took me less than 30 seconds to fully comprehend the absolute catastrophic magnitude of the financial destruction Derek had unleashed. He had not merely skimmed my checking accounts or diverted a few stray pension deposits. He had committed a profound, systemic financial violation. Mitchell leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table. He took out an $800,000 home equity line of credit against the Dallas property. Mitchell stated, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. I stared at the bold, undeniable numbers stamped across the bank letterhead. I had paid cash for 80% of that magnificent house just 4 years ago, leaving only a small, manageable mortgage entirely in Derek's name to help him build his personal credit score. It was a generous, fatherly gesture meant to secure his future. Instead, he had secretly weaponized that small mortgage, using it to aggressively leverage the massive equity I had personally funded. He forged your signature on the guarantor forms, manipulated the title documents, and convinced a shady secondary lender to approve a massive line of credit based entirely on the inflated appraisal value of your initial cash investment, Mitchell explained calmly. My blood ran cold, a heavy block of pure, unadulterated ice dropping directly into the pit of my stomach. Derek had effectively stolen the very roof over my head, transforming the safe, secure sanctuary I had built into a massive, highly leveraged financial casino. He took an $800,000 gamble using money that did not belong to him. I flipped to the next page of the thick report, my steady fingers tracing the tragic downward trajectory of his stolen funds. The money had not been invested in legitimate businesses, stable real estate, or conservative index funds. The entire $800,000 had been systematically transferred into a series of highly volatile, utterly unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. He bought into speculative digital tokens right at the absolute peak of a manipulated market frenzy. When the inevitable crash occurred just 3 months later, his massive leveraged portfolio evaporated into nothing but worthless digital dust. He lost every single penny, Mitchell confirmed, watching my eyes scan the devastating loss columns. The offshore entity, Apex Holdings, was nothing but a desperate, empty shell used to facilitate his catastrophic gambling addiction. But the sheer, unbridled financial carnage did not stop with Derek. I turned the page and found a separate, equally horrifying stack of credit reports belonging entirely to Monica. While Derek was aggressively burning through my home equity in the digital markets, she was living a lavish, delusional fantasy in the real world. Monica had completely maxed out 5 separate high-limit platinum credit cards. The itemized statements were a sickening testament to her superficial greed. There were charges for $30,000 designer handbags, extravagant first-class flights to exclusive European resorts, imported luxury vehicles, and custom-tailored designer wardrobes. They were living a multi-million-dollar lifestyle entirely funded by massive unsustainable debt and my stolen equity. I closed the heavy folder, my jaw clenched so tightly, my teeth ached. The ultimate devastating blow was detailed on the final page of Mitchell's meticulous report. A formal, certified notice of default from the secondary lender. Derek had completely missed the last 4 consecutive payments on the massive equity loan. "They are bleeding out," Mitchell said, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "The bank has officially initiated the recovery process. You have exactly 60 days before they aggressively foreclose on the property, seize the mansion, and physically evict everyone from the premises. They are utterly desperate, Victor. That is exactly why they are trying to rush this fraudulent power of attorney and have you legally declared mentally incompetent. They absolutely need to access your primary retirement accounts and liquidate your Pennsylvania farms to pay off this massive disaster before the bank throws them out onto the street." I took a slow, deliberate sip of bitter black coffee. The scalding liquid burned my dry throat, but the physical sensation grounded my racing thoughts. The entire horrifying scope of their murderous treachery was now perfectly and clearly illuminated in front of me. Mitchell slowly reached deep into his suit jacket, his expression hardening into a look of predatory anticipation. "Do we call the cops now?" Mitchell asked, his deep voice carrying a lethal edge. "We have more than enough hard evidence to put them both behind bars today." I placed the warm mug on the scratched Formica table and looked directly into my loyal attorney's eyes. I slowly shook my head. "No," I replied, my voice completely stripped of any human warmth. "I want them to think they have finally won. Draft me a Trojan horse." Mitchell leaned back heavily against the cracked red vinyl of the diner booth. The sudden silence stretching between us, broken only by the distant rhythmic clatter of cheap porcelain dishes from the greasy kitchen. A slow, terrifying grin spread across his weathered, deeply lined face. It was the exact same predatory expression I had seen him wear decades ago, right before he utterly dismantled a corrupt union boss on a crowded witness stand. He understood precisely what I was asking for. A simple police report would definitely put Derek in handcuffs today, but it would also instantly freeze everything I owned in a protracted, messy criminal investigation. More importantly, simply calling the authorities would completely deprive me of the profound personal satisfaction of watching my treacherous son confidently trigger his own total destruction. I did not just want Derek stopped. I wanted him to feel the exact moment his greedy, fabricated empire collapsed around him. I wanted him to reach greedily for the final prize and find his hands caught in an inescapable steel trap. Mitchell gathered the devastating financial reports from the scratched Formica table and slid them back into his heavy leather briefcase. He tossed a crumpled $20 bill onto the table to cover the untouched coffee and gestured for me to follow him. We walked out of the bleak, greasy diner and climbed into his sleek, black town car. We drove in absolute silence toward his prestigious downtown law firm. The massive glass building represented the absolute pinnacle of corporate legal warfare. We bypassed the elegant main reception area and walked directly into his private, soundproof corner office, overlooking the sprawling Dallas skyline. Mitchell immediately locked the heavy mahogany door shed, his expensive suit jacket, and booted up his secured desktop computer. It was time to systematically engineer the ultimate legal snare. I sat in the plush leather guest chair and meticulously outlined the specific details of the fraudulent power of attorney document Derek had tried to force upon me the previous afternoon. I accurately described the broad, sweeping language Monica had likely downloaded from some cheap, generic legal website. They needed absolute, unchecked authority to aggressively liquidate my newly inherited real estate portfolio. They needed my legal proxy to secretly auction off the 3 sprawling Pennsylvania farms and the pristine Naples coastal house without requiring my physical signature on a single closing document. They believed I was too heavily medicated, too consumed by manufactured dementia, to ever notice a few altered paragraphs in a dense legal contract. Mitchell's fingers flew across his mechanical keyboard with practiced, lethal efficiency. He expertly pulled up a standard, highly aggressive Texas power of attorney template on his massive monitor. "We are going to give your arrogant son exactly what he wants," Victor Mitchell muttered, his eyes locked onto the glowing screen. "We are going to draft a document that looks absolutely flawlessly identical to his amateur paperwork. We will use the exact same standard margins, the identical legal font, and the exact same boring, repetitive boilerplate language on the first 3 pages. When Derek quickly scans this document, his greedy eyes will immediately see the total financial authorization he so desperately craves. He will see the unchecked power to manage your banking, handle your real estate, and execute your legal contracts." But the 4th page was where Mitchell unleashed his true, terrifying brilliance. Buried deep within a dense, mind-numbing paragraph detailing interstate property management protocols, Mitchell meticulously crafted a microscopic, legally binding poison pill. It was a clause composed of such dense, convoluted legal terminology that even an experienced junior attorney would easily miss its true catastrophic implications on a quick reading. Derek, blinded by his own frantic greed and crippling cryptocurrency debts, would never even bother to read the fine print. He was far too arrogant and far too desperate to look for a trap. Mitchell carefully explained the complex mechanics of the lethal snare. The exact moment Derek attempted to utilize this specific power of attorney to initiate the sale, transfer, or liquidation of any out-of-state assets, primarily the Pennsylvania farms or the Florida coastal property, a devastating legal cascade would instantly trigger. The clause explicitly stated that any such out-of-state transaction automatically and irrevocably categorized my original massive cash investment in the Dallas mansion as a direct, callable financial loan rather than a familial gift. Furthermore, the deeply buried legal provision immediately converted my 80% cash equity into a senior absolute primary lien against the Dallas property. The sheer brilliance of this maneuver was breathtaking. By attempting to steal my inherited wealth, Derek would legally and instantly completely void his own ownership stake in the mansion. This ironclad primary lien would immediately supersede his fraudulent home equity line of credit. The moment the bank algorithms registered the sudden massive legal encumbrance, it would automatically trigger a catastrophic financial freeze. Every single bank account tied to Derek's Social Security number, every credit line, and every single digital asset portal would be instantly and permanently locked down, pending a massive fraud investigation. He would be completely paralyzed. He would walk into a title office confidently expecting to walk out with $30 million from your father's estate. Mitchell explained, his voice low and intensely focused. But the second that escrow agent runs this specific authorization code, Derek will instantly lose his house, his cars, his credit cards, and his remaining freedom. He will literally bankrupt himself with a single stroke of his own pen. And because he willingly executes the document to steal from you, he will provide the federal prosecutors with absolute undeniable proof of his malicious, premeditated financial crimes. It is completely foolproof, Victor. It is an absolute masterpiece of legal destruction. Mitchell pressed a button on his desk, and the heavy laser printer in the corner of the office hummed to life. The machine rhythmically spit out 5 crisp white pages of dense legal text. Mitchell gathered the warm papers, expertly stapled them together in the top left corner, and slid the stack across the polished mahogany desk. I picked up the document, the heavy paper feeling incredibly substantial in my calloused hands. I slowly turned to the 4th page, my eyes scanning the dense block of text. To the untrained, greedy eye, it looked like standard, boring, bureaucratic filler. But to me, it was a perfectly crafted instrument of absolute vengeance. I carefully folded the thick legal document precisely in half. I slid it deep into the interior breast pocket of my worn denim jacket, feeling the sharp edge of the paper resting securely against my chest. The paralyzing shock of their initial betrayal had been entirely replaced by a cold, calculating sense of purpose. I thanked Mitchell for his brilliant, ruthless efficiency and walked out of the towering glass building into the bright Dallas afternoon. I climbed back into my vintage Ford truck and started the engine. I was heading straight back to the mansion, walking directly back into the enemy camp. I was about to sit down with my treacherous, debt-ridden son, look him directly in his deceitful eyes, and hand him a live, unpinned grenade perfectly disguised as a solid gold bar. The drive back to the sprawling suburban estate felt entirely different from my frantic escape just a few hours prior. The cold dread that had gripped my chest was completely gone, replaced by a dark, simmering anticipation. I pulled my vintage truck into the long paved driveway, intentionally parking at a slight, careless angle. I killed the engine and sat in the quiet cabin for a moment, taking a deep breath to center myself. I had to bury the sharp, calculating businessman deeply beneath the frail, broken shell of a grieving widower. I pulled the heavy, folded legal document from my interior jacket pocket, gripping it tightly until my knuckles ached, and then stepped out into the oppressive Texas heat. I shuffled up the stone walkway, dragging my boots against the concrete, and pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors. The house was quiet, but the distinct scent of Monica's expensive floral perfume hung thickly in the conditioned air. I found them both in the sunlit living room. Derek was aggressively pacing behind the plush leather sofa, a cell phone pressed tightly to his ear, while Monica sat scrolling through a glossy catalog. They froze the second I entered the room. Derek abruptly ended his phone call, shoving the device into his tailored slacks. His face immediately transformed into that sickening, patronizing mask of filial concern. He rushed forward, asking where I had been all morning. I did not answer him right away. I let my shoulders slump heavily forward, allowing my chin to rest near my chest. I purposefully induced a severe tremor in my right hand, letting the folded legal document shake visibly in my grasp. I walked over to the modern glass coffee table with agonizing slowness and collapsed into the nearest armchair, releasing a long, incredibly ragged sigh that echoed through the vaulted room. I looked up at my son, making sure my eyes appeared bloodshot and entirely devoid of any fighting spirit. "Derek," I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured frailty. "I am just so incredibly tired." The weight of this grief is completely crushing me. I went for a long drive this morning trying to clear my foggy head, but I just feel so lost without your grandfather. Managing his massive estate, dealing with the out-of-state property taxes, trying to decipher all of the endless legal jargon, it is simply too much for my failing mind to handle right now. I leaned forward, my shaking hands resting heavily on my knees. I cannot fight this battle anymore, my boy. You were absolutely right yesterday. I need to rest. I need to surrender this heavy burden to someone younger. Someone I completely trust to protect our family legacy. The atmosphere in the living room shifted with electric intensity. Derek and Monica completely abandoned their fake sympathy, their postures straightening as a primal, undisguised greed flared brightly behind their eyes. They looked like two starving wolves watching a wounded deer finally collapse in the snow. Monica practically vibrated with excitement, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the sofa cushions. Derek took a slow, calculated step toward me, trying desperately to keep his voice steady and soothing. "You are making the right decision, Dad," he murmured, kneeling beside my chair and placing a clammy hand over my shaking fingers. "We will take care of absolutely everything. You will not have to worry about a single financial detail ever again." I slowly unfolded Mitchell's brilliantly crafted Trojan horse and laid it flat on the glass coffee table. "It is the exact power of attorney you asked me to review." I lied softly, staring directly into his deceitful eyes. "I just want it all handled." Derek did not even bother to read the first paragraph. He was far too blinded by his crushing debts and his desperate desire for my millions to look for a trap. He swiftly pulled a sleek silver pen from his jacket pocket and thrust it into my trembling hand. I gripped the pen loosely, letting the tip rattle against the crisp white paper for a few seconds before meticulously signing my name on the final signature line. I legally handed over the keys to the kingdom, effectively pinning the grenade straight to his chest. Derek snatched the signed document from the glass table with terrifying speed, clutching it to his chest, as if I might suddenly change my mind and snatch it back. He beamed at Monica, a silent, victorious communication passing rapidly between them. "Now that the boring paperwork is entirely out of the way," Monica chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "you really need to focus on your emotional recovery. We should definitely look into booking that luxury wellness retreat we discussed yesterday." I raised a trembling hand to silence her. "Actually," I whispered, keeping my gaze fixed on the floor. "I saw a flyer at the community center this morning. There is a specialized 3-day grief counseling seminar exclusively for military veterans taking place down in Austin starting tonight. I think being surrounded by men my own age, men who understand profound loss, would be far more beneficial for my soul than a fancy spa. I want to drive down there this afternoon." Derek and Monica practically glowed with unrestrained joy. The absolute last thing they wanted was me lingering in the house while they aggressively liquidated my inherited assets. A 3-day absence provided them with the perfect uninterrupted window to execute their massive financial theft. "That is a truly wonderful idea, Dad." Derek agreed eagerly, already backing away toward his home office with the lethal document in his hand. "You take the truck drive down to Austin and take all the time you need to heal. We have everything under total control here." I offered them one final pathetic nod of surrender and slowly shuffled back to my guest suite. The moment the heavy bedroom door clicked shut behind me, the tremors instantly ceased. I moved with rapid, deliberate efficiency, tossing a few changes of clothes and basic toiletries into a small canvas duffel bag. I securely packed my hidden laptop and the encrypted burner phone, ensuring my digital command center was fully operational. I walked back through the main house, ignoring their overly enthusiastic farewells, and climbed into my vintage truck. I drove exactly 1 mile down the main avenue and pulled into the shaded parking lot of a quiet, mid-range business hotel. I paid for a 3-night stay entirely in cash, walked up to my secluded room on the 3rd floor, and locked the door securely behind me. I set my duffel bag on the floor, sat down at the small wooden desk, and opened the black laptop. I connected to the secure remote cloud server and tapped the activation key. The screen instantly lit up with 3 high-definition, crystal-clear video feeds. I could see the living room, the kitchen, and Derek sitting proudly at his mahogany desk, hungrily staring at the poisoned power of attorney. The lethal and absolutely devastating trap was perfectly set, and the ultimate show was finally about to officially begin tonight. I did not have to wait long for the digital curtain to rise. I sat motionless in the hotel chair, the glow of the laptop screen casting long shadows across the small room. The city traffic hummed faintly outside, but my focus was channeled into the high-definition feed streaming from Derek's office. The digital clock on the bottom corner of my screen ticked past 10. Derek had returned from his expensive wine-tasting event, slipping away from Monica to retreat into his private sanctuary. The hidden camera embedded in the wall charger captured him perfectly. He was sitting heavily at his mahogany desk. His silk tie loosened his jacket, thrown carelessly over the back of his chair. He looked physically exhausted, his shoulders slumped, his face illuminated by the stark blue light of his monitors. He poured himself a glass of amber scotch, his hand trembling slightly, as he brought the tumbler to his lips. He was a man drowning in his manufactured reality, suffocating under the crushing weight of the financial catastrophe he had created. I watched his chest rise and fall as he took a deep, jagged breath. He reached down into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. My eyes narrowed. I immediately recognized the heavy seal and the return address printed clearly on the corner. It was the legal correspondence from my late father's estate attorneys in Pennsylvania, the exact mail he had intercepted and hidden from me just a few days ago. Derek tore open the heavy envelope with frantic, uncoordinated movements. He dumped the thick stack of legal documents and property appraisals directly onto the center of his polished desk. He pushed his empty scotch glass aside and leaned forward, his greedy eyes scanning the dense pages. I watched the hidden camera feed intently, observing the exact moment his breathing hitched. A loud, audible gasp escaped his lips, captured with crystal-clear precision by the hidden microphone. He picked up the primary appraisal document, bringing it closer to his face as if he could not quite believe the numbers printed on the crisp white paper. He was finally seeing the absolute, staggering truth of my inheritance. He was looking at the official assessments for 3 massive, fully operational agricultural farms sprawling across the fertile plains of Pennsylvania. He flipped the page, his hands visibly shaking now, and discovered the secondary asset, a pristine coastal property located on the water in Naples, Florida. The combined market value of these unencumbered assets was astronomical. It was generational wealth meticulously built through decades of my father's blood, sweat, and relentless physical labor. It was a proud, honest legacy that Derek was currently viewing as nothing more than a convenient lifeline to rescue his pathetic, fraudulent lifestyle. He greedily traced the massive figures with his trembling index finger, realizing the sheer magnitude of the grand fortune. He took another long gulp of his expensive scotch, his eyes darting frantically around the silent room as if he expected someone to rip the papers away. I waited to see if he would stand up, walk down the hall, and share this massive financial revelation with his ambitious wife. I wondered if Monica would be brought in to help him celebrate his ultimate victory. But Derek did not move from his leather chair. He did not call out for Monica. Instead, he quickly wiped a thick bead of nervous sweat from his forehead and began frantically shuffling through the scattered papers on his desk. He was not looking for a way to share the inherited wealth. He was frantically looking for a rapid exit strategy to cover his massive secret debts. He aggressively pushed the appraisal documents aside and grabbed his smartphone. His fingers flew across the digital keypad, scrolling through his encrypted contacts. He raised the phone to his ear, his leg bouncing nervously under the heavy wooden desk. The sensitive audio feed picked up the faint ringing tone. He was not calling a reputable wealth manager. He was not contacting a legitimate estate broker to carefully list the grand properties on the open market. He was calling a bottom feeder. A gruff, impatient voice answered on the third ring. Derek sat up straight, his tone immediately shifting into a posture of frantic, desperate authority. "Listen to me very closely," Derek commanded, his voice tight and breathless. "I have a massive portfolio of out-of-state real estate that needs moving immediately. I am talking about 3 large commercial farms in Pennsylvania and a prime coastal lot in Florida." The gruff voice on the other end of the line grumbled something unintelligible, questioning the abrupt late-night proposition and the legal authority to execute such a massive transaction. Derek did not hesitate at all. He reached across his desk and slammed his hand down flat on top of the Trojan horse document I had signed just a few hours prior. The trap Mitchell had so brilliantly constructed was now resting directly under his greedy palm. "My dad is a vegetable," Derek spat into the receiver, the cruel, venomous words echoing through my quiet hotel room. "His mind is completely gone, but I have the paperwork. I have a full legally binding power of attorney executed today. I have absolute control over his entire estate." The liquidator mumbled another question, clearly asking about the timeline and the expected financial return for such a rushed sale. Derek leaned closer to the hidden microphone, his voice dropping to a harsh, feral whisper. "I want to liquidate the Pennsylvania farms for cash in 72 hours. I do not care if it is half the actual market value. Just get me the money I absolutely need, the cash wired directly to my private offshore accounts, by the end of the week, no questions asked. I will forward all of the signed legal authorizations and property deeds to your secure server right now." The call ended abruptly. Derek tossed his phone onto the desk. He buried his face in his hands, releasing a long breath of pure relief. He believed he had just saved himself. He believed he had leveraged my father's lifelong legacy to erase his cryptocurrency debts and save his Dallas mansion from imminent bank foreclosure. He was willing to strip away his own grandfather's life of hard work for mere pennies on the dollar, all to preserve his artificial status among his superficial friends. I sat back in the dim hotel room, staring at his frozen image on my laptop screen. The unadulterated evil of his actions washed over me completely, validating every aggressive countermeasure Mitchell and I had implemented. He had willingly bitten into the poison pill with absolute enthusiasm. By initiating the liquidation of those specific out-of-state farms, using the fraudulent power of attorney, Derek had unknowingly activated the trap. He had legally converted my original cash investment into a primary lien, officially voiding his ownership of the mansion and triggering an automatic freeze on all of his financial assets. I watched my son willingly sell out his grandfather's legacy to cover his own pathetic crypto debts. But the worst is yet to come. I watched the office camera feed as Derek practically sprinted out of his study. He grabbed his keys from the kitchen counter, shouting a rushed goodbye to Monica. He claimed he had an emergency meeting with a local real estate broker to finalize the paperwork. The heavy front door slammed shut, and the powerful engine of his sports car roared to life, quickly fading into the quiet suburban night. The house was now completely silent. I switched my primary focus to the living room feed. Monica was still sitting on the plush leather sofa. The moment Derek was gone, her entire demeanor shifted. The bored, superficial housewife vanished. Her posture straightened, her eyes sharpened, and a cold, calculating smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face. She tossed her glossy catalog onto the glass coffee table and immediately snatched her smartphone from her designer purse. She did not hesitate. She dialed a number with practiced speed, her manicured fingers flying across the glowing screen. She pressed the phone to her ear and leaned back against the expensive cushions. The high-definition microphone picked up the faint ringing tone. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, my heart beating a steady, rhythmic pulse in the quiet hotel room. I expected her to call a girlfriend to brag about their impending windfall. I expected her to start shopping online for another $30,000 handbag. But the voice that answered the call was undeniably male. It was a smooth, confident, and deeply familiar baritone. "Hey, baby," the man said. "Tell me the idiot finally took the bait." Monica let out a sharp, ruthless laugh that echoed through the empty mansion. It worked perfectly, Greg, she replied, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. The old fool signed the paperwork an hour ago. So, Derek is practically vibrating with excitement. He just left to meet his shady broker to fast-track the liquidation of the Pennsylvania farms. He is so incredibly desperate to cover his digital gambling debts that he is selling off prime agricultural real estate for absolute pennies. I sat frozen in my chair. Greg. The name bounced around in my mind for a fraction of a second before the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Greg was Derek's former college roommate and his current supposed best friend. He was a flashy personal injury lawyer who frequented their lavish dinner parties, always drinking my expensive wine and offering me fake, polite smiles. Monica and Greg were not just having a sordid, secret affair. They were actively conspiring to utterly destroy my son. I adjusted the volume on my laptop, refusing to miss a single syllable of this treacherous exchange. "We need to move quickly," Greg warned, his voice crackling slightly over the pristine audio feed. "Derek is stupid, but the banks are not. Once that massive cash wire hits his domestic accounts, it is going to trigger automatic fraud alerts. We have a very narrow window before everything gets frozen in a bureaucratic nightmare." Monica casually inspected her fingernails, completely unbothered by the logistical hurdles. "Do not worry about the banking protocols," she purred confidently. "I have already pre-authorized the external transfer routing numbers on our joint checking account. Derek gave me the master passwords months ago so I could manage the household bills. The very second that farm liquidation cash clears the holding period and drops into our primary account, I am immediately sweeping exactly half of it directly into the secure, untraceable offshore account you secretly set up for us in the beautiful, incredibly sunny Bahamas. I am leaving him just enough to think he survived, just enough to keep him distracted while I make my final exit." "It is absolutely brilliant," Greg chuckled darkly. "By the time he realizes the offshore transfer was executed, you will already be entirely gone." Monica sighed happily, kicking off her expensive heels and tucking her legs beneath her on the soft leather. "I have already started discreetly packing my most valuable jewelry and designer bags," she confessed with a wicked smile. "I am officially filing the divorce papers the very next morning. My high-priced lawyers are ready to serve him the exact moment the wire transfer is legally confirmed. We can finally be together in Miami, Greg. Just you, me, and a cool $15 million in untaxed, untraceable cash. We will buy that gorgeous penthouse overlooking the ocean and never look back at this pathetic, stressful life ever again." The sheer, unadulterated coldness of her elaborate plan was genuinely staggering. She was not just cheating on her wealthy husband. She was meticulously plotting to strip away half of his stolen inheritance, leave him legally tethered to a collapsing marriage, and vanish into a tropical paradise with his closest friend. She was a ruthless financial predator, calmly waiting for Derek to do all the dirty, illegal work before she violently swooped in to steal the ultimate prize. "What about Derek?" Greg asked, a hint of cruel amusement coloring his smooth voice. "How is the great cryptocurrency king going to handle the sudden divorce and the unexpectedly missing millions?" Monica laughed again, a harsh, grating sound that made my skin completely crawl. "Derek will be left holding an entirely empty bag," she sneered, her eyes gleaming with profound malice. "He is going to lose absolutely everything very soon indeed. The massive bank is already actively preparing to foreclose on this ridiculous oversized house because he abruptly stopped paying the massive home equity loan months ago. When I secretly take half the farm money, he will definitely not have enough capital to satisfy the furious secondary lender and cover his massive outstanding tax liabilities. He will be left with a completely foreclosed mansion, a thoroughly ruined credit score, and an enormous mountain of insurmountable legal bills. He will absolutely have to declare total bankruptcy and eventually move into a cheap, disgusting apartment. It is exactly what he deserves for being such a pathetic, gullible, and completely arrogant loser." And the old man, Greg, casually inquired over the phone, Monica waved her delicate hand dismissively at the empty, quiet room. "Victor is completely handled," she stated firmly, her voice devoid of any human empathy. "The heavy unauthorized tranquilizers are doing their job perfectly right now. His frail brain is slowly turning to absolute useless mush. Once the farms are officially sold and the cash is finally secured, Derek is aggressively going to use the medical records to shove him directly into a cheap, state-run nursing home. He will rot away in Shady Pines completely and utterly forgotten and sadly, drooling into a plastic cup while we are happily sipping expensive cocktails on a pristine, sun-drenched beach." I stared directly at the digital video feed, my stomach violently churning with absolute unbridled disgust. The toxic venom flowing from her mouth was genuinely breathtaking. They brutally viewed me as nothing more than an inconvenient piece of dying, useless meat. I watched her smile widely at the hidden camera, completely unaware of her impending doom. I was disgusted by her venom, but the conversation took a turn that made my blood run cold. Greg's voice hummed through the small laptop speakers, casually shifting the conversation from stolen millions to domestic logistics. He asked how she planned to handle the transition with the child once the divorce papers were officially served. Monica let out a soft, affection-laced sigh that I had never once heard her direct toward my son. "I cannot wait to get Tommy away from Derek," she murmured, her voice dripping with an eerie, genuine longing that sharply contrasted with her previous venom. "It physically makes me sick watching Derek play dad every single day when Tommy clearly has your eyes, Greg. It is suffocating living in this house pretending we are a happy little family while looking at our son and knowing the truth." Greg chuckled, a low, arrogant sound of total triumph. "Are you absolutely certain the idiot will not demand a second look at the medical records?" During the divorce proceedings, Greg asked, a faint trace of caution lingering beneath his bravado. Monica laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Please, Greg. Derek is completely, hopelessly blind. He is so utterly desperate to project the image of a perfect, wealthy patriarch that he will believe whatever reality I hand him. Do not worry about a thing. Derek will never figure out the initial paternity test was completely faked. I paid that clinic technician handsomely to alter the DNA results 3 years ago, and those records are permanently buried. Tommy is entirely ours. He always has been, my love." The cheap ceramic coffee mug slipped right through my trembling fingers. It hit the carpeted floor of the hotel room, with a dull, heavy thud splashing lukewarm brown liquid across my boots and the baseboard. I did not flinch. I did not move to clean up the expanding stain. I could not breathe. The oxygen in the small room seemed to instantly vanish, leaving me gasping in a terrifying, suffocating vacuum. The sheer magnitude of this new revelation was practically unfathomable. Tommy. My sweet, innocent 3-year-old grandson. The bright-eyed little boy I had spent countless hours with, pushing him on the backyard swing, reading him endless bedtime stories, and teaching him how to properly hold a baseball. The boy I had looked at with such profound pride, genuinely believing he was the beautiful continuation of the Caldwell family bloodline. My mind raced back to the day he was born, remembering the tears of joy in Derek's eyes as he held the tiny infant, proudly declaring that the family legacy was officially secure. It was all a lie. My entire family was an elaborate, meticulously constructed illusion. The financial betrayal had been a devastating blow to my pride and my wallet, but this was a fatal strike directly to my soul. Monica and Greg had not merely conspired to steal my inherited wealth and leave my son completely destitute. They had actively manipulated the very foundation of our family. They had weaponized an innocent child, using Tommy as a prop, to secure Monica's position within the wealthy Caldwell household until she was ready to spring her final devastating trap. Derek was certainly a greedy, pathetic, weak-minded fool who was entirely willing to sacrifice his own father for a quick payout. But even he did not deserve this level of profound structural cruelty. He was raising another man's child, completely unaware that his wife and his supposed best friend were laughing at his pathetic ignorance behind closed doors. I sat in the dim light of the hotel room, my hands gripping the edge of the small wooden desk. Hot, stinging tears gathered in the corners of my eyes and slowly traced down my weathered cheeks. I wept for the innocent little boy who was currently sleeping in his designer nursery, completely oblivious to the dark, toxic web of lies surrounding his very existence. He was a pawn in a vicious multi-million-dollar game of chess, a child destined to be ripped away from the only father he had ever known the exact moment the stolen money cleared the offshore accounts. I wept for the absolute destruction of my family name, for the utter desecration of the legacy my grandfather and father had worked so tirelessly to build from the ground up. Everything I thought I knew, everything I had fought to protect, was entirely corrupted. The agonizing grief washed over me in violent, crushing waves, completely paralyzing my thoughts for several long minutes. I listened to Monica and Greg casually discuss their future life in Miami, entirely unfazed by the immense human wreckage they were leaving in their wake. They talked about private preschools for Tommy and luxury yacht memberships, spending my stolen money before it had even been properly wired. Their absolute lack of human empathy was staggering. They were predators feeding on the weakness and vulnerability of others. Slowly, the hot tears drying on my face began to cool. The crushing weight of the sorrow began to instantly compress, hardening into something dense, heavy, and incredibly dangerous. The profound grief was rapidly evaporating, entirely replaced by a cold, apocalyptic fury. My sadness transformed into pure, unadulterated rage. A burning, relentless fire ignited deep within my chest, sending a surge of powerful adrenaline through my veins. The tremors in my hands completely stopped. The physical weakness I had been carefully projecting all week officially vanished. I was no longer a grieving widower or a betrayed father. I was a man standing on the edge of total destruction, armed with the undeniable truth and the absolute power to rain down absolute hellfire upon my enemies. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve and sat up straight. The time for passive observation was over. The trap had been set, the bait had been taken, and the rats had gleefully confessed their sins directly into my hidden microphones. I had allowed them to dig their own graves, and they had enthusiastically excavated a massive, inescapable crater. There was absolutely no chance of redemption, no possibility of a peaceful, private resolution. This required total, uncompromising annihilation. They had tried to steal my wealth, my home, my freedom, and my family line. Now I was going to systematically strip away everything they held dear. I reached across the desk and picked up the encrypted burner phone. My thumb moved with rapid, flawless precision, dialing the familiar sequence of numbers. Mitchell Harding answered on the very first ring, his gruff voice immediately alert to the late hour of my call. He knew I would not contact him unless the situation had critically escalated. "Mitchell," I said, my voice eerily calm, perfectly devoid of any tremor or hesitation. It was the voice of a man who had officially crossed the point of no return. "I need you to completely mobilize the entire legal team immediately. I want every single motion drafted, every injunction prepared, and every asset freeze legally staged for immediate execution." There was a brief, heavy silence on the line. "Victor." "What exactly happened here?" Mitchell asked me, sensing the shift in tone. "He signed it tonight," I replied. "Bring the police. Bring everyone." We dropped the bomb on Monday. The sheer, breathtaking magnitude of Monica's final revelation hung heavily in the stale air of my quiet hotel room. Tommy was not my grandson. The precious little boy I had poured my heart and soul into, the innocent child I believed carried my family name, was nothing more than the product of a cheap, sordid affair with a sleazy personal injury lawyer. The sorrow that had initially paralyzed my chest was instantly incinerated by a cold, apocalyptic fury. I did not shed another tear. I picked up my encrypted burner phone and dialed Mitchell Harding, my voice steady and completely devoid of any remaining paternal weakness. I told my ruthless attorney to bring the police, bring the financial investigators, and bring every single legal weapon in his extensive arsenal. We were dropping the absolute unmitigated bomb first thing on Monday morning. I spent the entire weekend locked inside that nondescript hotel room, meticulously organizing the absolute destruction of the two parasites who had completely hijacked my life. I started with my own financial fortifications. I logged into my secure banking portal and swiftly transferred my remaining liquid cash reserves, the millions I had safely tucked away from Derek's greedy reach, into a series of newly established, highly encrypted trust accounts that Mitchell had prepared. I legally isolated every single penny of my personal wealth, completely shielding my assets from any potential collateral damage in the impending blast radius. I watched the green progress bars on my laptop screen slowly fill as the massive wire transfers cleared the strict banking protocols. I was systematically cutting the invisible financial lifelines, ensuring that neither Derek nor Monica could extract another dime from my hard-earned legacy to fund their inevitable desperate legal defense. By late Saturday afternoon, Mitchell officially initiated the lethal legal sequence. I remained on a secure conference call with him as he formally submitted the executed Trojan horse power of attorney to the secondary lending institution. The trap functioned with absolute terrifying perfection. The exact moment the bank algorithms processed the deeply buried poison pill clause, the system instantly recognized the massive, undeniable legal conflict. My original 80% cash investment in the sprawling Dallas mansion was formally and irrevocably converted into a senior primary lien against the entire property. The catastrophic financial dominoes began to fall with incredible, unyielding speed. The bank immediately panicked, realizing their $800,000 home equity line of credit was completely superseded by my prior ironclad legal claim. They instantly triggered a total comprehensive freeze on the property and all associated financial accounts. Every single joint checking account, every high-limit platinum credit card, and every digital asset portal tied to Derek and Monica was locked down pending a massive fraud investigation. They were completely paralyzed, entirely stripped of their stolen financial power in a matter of seconds. I sat in the dim light of my hotel room, listening to Mitchell confirm the successful execution of the asset freeze. Derek and Monica were currently spending their final weekend lounging in their stolen mansion, entirely unaware that the massive financial floor had just been violently ripped out from beneath their feet. They believed they were waiting for millions of dollars to flood their bank accounts from the rushed sale of my Pennsylvania farms. Instead, they were sitting completely destitute, holding a collection of utterly worthless plastic cards. With the financial snare securely fastened, I turned my complete attention to the physical evidence. I needed to ensure the upcoming confrontation that was swift, absolute, and impossible to deny. I spent Sunday morning meticulously downloading the high-definition video and audio files from the secure cloud server. I isolated the exact, undeniable footage of Derek enthusiastically agreeing to liquidate his grandfather's cherished farms for pennies on the dollar. I saved the horrifying, crystal-clear audio clip of Monica casually discussing her lethal poisoning schedule, her secret offshore accounts, and her impending divorce. Most importantly, I isolated the sickening, undeniable confession regarding little Tommy. I transferred every single piece of digital evidence onto several encrypted flash drives. I wanted to make absolutely certain that law enforcement had every tool required to secure a rapid, inescapable criminal conviction. I moved to the small wooden desk and began physically compiling my arsenal. I laid out a series of neat, pristine manila folders across the smooth surface. Into the first folder, I placed the detailed toxicology screening from Dr. Thorne, the undeniable medical proof of the heavy lorazepam actively coursing through my veins. Into the second folder, I carefully slid the master property deed for the Dallas mansion, heavily annotated by Mitchell, to explicitly highlight my new dominant primary lien. Into the third folder, I placed the digital flash drives containing their venomous confessions and a printed transcript of Monica completely destroying her own marriage. I aligned the edges of the thick manila folders with slow, methodical precision, completely satisfied with the impenetrable wall of evidence I had constructed. I had transformed their arrogance into their absolute undoing. The quiet weekend passed in a steady blur of incredibly focused, relentless, and meticulous preparation for the final conflict. I did not sleep. I did not feel the typical aches and pains of my 70 years. I was fueled entirely by a pure, unadulterated sense of righteous justice. Finally, the long, quiet weekend ended. The sun began to slowly rise on Monday morning, casting brilliant streaks of orange and gold across the sprawling Dallas skyline. I stood by the large hotel window, watching the city slowly wake up, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of the impending confrontation settling deeply into my bones. I turned away from the glass and walked over to the small closet. I completely bypassed the worn denim jackets and soft flannel shirts I had been wearing during my pathetic, fragile old man routine. I reached into my canvas duffel bag and pulled out a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. I had intentionally brought it specifically for this exact defining moment. I buttoned the crisp white dress shirt, fastened the dark silk tie, and slipped on a pair of polished, heavy leather shoes. I stood in front of the full-length mirror mounted on the bathroom door and critically examined my reflection. The frail, trembling, confused victim they had brutally exploited was completely gone. The grieving widower who had blindly trusted his only son was erased. I straightened my shoulders, rolling my neck, until the joints popped sharply in the quiet room. The man staring back at me was a seasoned, hardened veteran of the heavy machinery industry. I was a man who had spent 4 decades navigating cutthroat union negotiations and crushing corrupt corporate rivals. I gathered the 3 thick manila folders from the wooden desk, tucking them securely under my arm. I picked up my encrypted burner phone and sent a single brief text message to Mitchell Harding, confirming my immediate departure. I walked out of the hotel room, my heavy footsteps echoing down the long, empty corridor. I was no longer the tired old man they had callously tried to discard. I was the ruthless, unforgiving contractor who bulldozes absolutely anything standing in his way. The morning sun glared off my vintage truck as I pulled into the sprawling Dallas suburb, parking discreetly near the ostentatious estate I helped finance. Mitchell Harding was already waiting for me at the corner, leaning against his sleek black sedan. He looked impeccable in a navy blue suit, clutching a thick leather briefcase holding the financial ruin of my son. Beside him stood 2 broad-shouldered, uniformed police officers. I walked up to them, my custom-tailored charcoal suit fitting like armor. Mitchell gave a sharp nod of confirmation. We began our march toward the property, our footsteps moving in unison against the paved concrete. As the estate came into view, a bitter surge of disgust tightened my chest. Sitting idle in the center of the stone driveway was a battered, cheap medical transport van. Its white paint was peeling, displaying a faded logo for an assisted living facility. Derek had wasted no time. Believing he secured the millions from my farms, he summoned this bottom-feeding service to haul his father away to a state-run facility. It was the ultimate confirmation of his profound cruelty. I felt no sorrow, only a cold drive to execute the final demolition. I marched directly up the wide stone walkway, ignoring the confused transport driver smoking by his van. I did not bother knocking. I raised my heavy leather boot and kicked the grand mahogany front doors with the devastating force of a man who spent 40 years working heavy construction. The heavy doors slammed open the expensive brass lock, shattering instantly inward. The sound echoed through the vaulted foyer like a gunshot. I strode into the sunlit living room, radiating absolute, unyielding authority. Mitchell Harding marched a step behind my right shoulder, and the 2 uniformed police officers filed in immediately behind us, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. The scene inside the living room froze as if someone had hit the pause button on a television remote. Derek was standing near the expensive glass coffee table, holding a stack of travel brochures. Monica was sitting on the plush leather sofa, sipping a green smoothie, wearing a silk robe and a smug expression. The second the shattered doors banged against the interior walls, Monica dropped her glass. The green liquid splattered across the imported rug, ignored. Derek spun around, his jaw dropping open in paralyzed shock. He stared at my imposing suit, my steady posture, and the complete absence of the manufactured tremor in my hands. His eyes darted frantically from my cold face to the grim expression of my attorney, and finally to the two police officers flanking the entryway. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, trapped animal. "Dad," Derek stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic pitch. He took a stumbling step backward, clutching the fraudulent paperwork to his chest. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be at the Veterans Retreat in Austin. The transport van is outside." "You are severely confused, Dad. You are having an episode. The medical team is here to take you to a safe facility where you can get the psychiatric help you need. I signed the power of attorney yesterday. Remember, I did not break my stride. I walked slowly and deliberately across the expensive rug, closing the distance between us, until I was standing mere inches away from his trembling frame. I looked down at him, my expression carved from solid granite. A cold, ruthless smirk slowly spread across my face. "I am not confused, Derek," I stated, my voice echoing with a deep, booming resonance that had commanded hundreds of men on chaotic construction sites. "But you certainly are. You were so blinded by your pathetic cryptocurrency gambling debts and your desperate, pathetic need to maintain this superficial illusion of wealth that you failed to do the one thing a competent businessman always does. You did not read the fine print." Derek swallowed hard, his eyes widening in mounting panic. He looked down at the documents clutched in his sweaty hands, then back up at my unforgiving gaze. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "I have total control. I signed the documents. I authorized the immediate sale of the Pennsylvania properties last night." "You authorized absolutely nothing," I countered, my tone slicing through his pathetic bravado like a razor. "You triggered a trap designed specifically for a greedy, disloyal fool. The power of attorney you so eagerly signed was not a surrender of my assets. It was a highly sophisticated, legally binding financial snare. You did not take my money, Derek. You legally signed away everything you thought you owned." Monica suddenly sprang up from the sofa, her face contorted in a mask of panic and fury. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at me. "We are legally married. This is our home. We are the masters of this estate. You are just a crazy, demented old man throwing a temper tantrum. We will have you committed immediately." I turned my gaze to Monica, feeling a surge of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Save your pathetic performance, Monica," I commanded, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "I know everything. I know about Greg. I know about the offshore accounts in the Bahamas. I know about your meticulous plan to steal the liquidation money file for divorce and abandon my son to a foreclosure. I know you faked the paternity test for Tommy." Monica gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The sheer terror in her eyes was incredibly satisfying. She collapsed back onto the sofa, completely destroyed by the sudden, brutal exposure of her most guarded secrets. Derek slowly turned his head to look at his wife, his mind struggling to comprehend the massive tidal wave of betrayal crashing down upon him. He looked completely shattered, a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had tried to discard me just a few days ago. Mitchell Harding stepped forward, moving with the slick, predatory grace of a corporate shark, smelling blood in the water. He opened his heavy leather briefcase and withdrew a thick, professionally bound document. He slapped the paperwork down onto the center of the glass coffee table. The sound cracked like a whip in the silent, tense room. "By attempting an unauthorized, deeply discounted sale of the Pennsylvania agricultural farms, using that compromised document, you explicitly triggered the primary penalty clause embedded deep within the trust agreements." Mitchell announced, his voice cold and strictly chillingly professional. "The massive secondary lending institution was formally notified immediately. The bank has officially and completely frozen all of your domestic accounts. Your massive home equity line of credit has been instantly and permanently revoked. Furthermore, Mr. Caldwell's original cash investment has been legally converted into a senior overriding lien against this entire property. Your remaining property equity is entirely and totally voided. You no longer own a single fraction of this estate. You are currently standing inside a property entirely owned and controlled by my client. Mitchell adjusted his tie and offered Derek a chilling, bureaucratic smile. You are both officially trespassing. Derek's mind visibly short-circuited. He staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing, like a suffocating fish, turning his desperate, pleading eyes toward Monica for any semblance of support or a logical explanation. But Monica was completely frozen, her smug mask entirely shattered, her manicured hands trembling as the terrifying reality of her situation finally set in. I did not give them a single second to recover. I stepped forward, reaching into the second manila folder tucked firmly under my arm. I pulled out the crisp, undeniable medical documentation and dropped the thick toxicology report directly onto the center of the glass coffee table, right beside Mitchell's foreclosure notice. Officer, I stated, my voice echoing with cold, unyielding authority. This document is absolute medical proof of systematic intentional poisoning carried out by my daughter-in-law. She has been secretly slipping heavy unauthorized doses of lorazepam into my evening tea to artificially induce dementia. Monica shrieked a piercing, hysterical sound that bounced violently off the vaulted ceiling. That is a lie, she screamed, her face turning a blotchy, frantic red as she pointed an accusing finger at me. He is a crazy, paranoid old man. You cannot possibly believe a single word he is saying. I did absolutely nothing to him. I did not argue with her pathetic, desperate lies. I simply reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a small, high-definition Bluetooth speaker, and placed it gently on the table. I pressed the play button. Instantly, Monica's own voice filled the silent room, crisp, arrogant, and dripping with venom. The recording broadcasted her entire ruthless conversation with Greg. Derek listened in absolute paralyzed horror as his wife gleefully confessed her plan to steal the liquidation money, leave him drowning in insurmountable foreclosure debt, and vanish to a Miami penthouse. But the final, most devastating blow struck when the audio feed reached the ultimate betrayal. The recording clearly captured Monica's cruel laughter as she proudly admitted that their precious little boy Tommy belonged to Greg, and that Derek was nothing more than a gullible, pathetic fool raising another man's child. The sound of her own treacherous voice completely destroyed the last remaining fragment of her defense. Derek let out a raw, guttural sound, a primal scream of absolute soul-crushing agony. He collapsed heavily onto his knees, right there on the expensive rug, clutching his head and screaming hysterically at the woman he thought loved him. The two police officers immediately stepped forward, their metal handcuffs rattling sharply in the tense air. They forcefully pulled a violently thrashing Monica to her feet, reading her rights as they arrested her for severe elder abuse and malicious poisoning. Derek was hauled up right beside her, cuffed and formally charged with massive documented financial fraud. They viciously tore at each other, screaming bitter, hateful curses as the officers dragged them out the shattered front doors and shoved them into the back of the waiting squad cars. I stood perfectly still, watching the flashing red and blue lights paint the suburban street, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, satisfying closure. 2 weeks later, the nightmare was behind me. I stood on the expansive wooden balcony of my newly inherited coastal home in Naples, Florida, watching the gentle morning waves roll across the beach. I raised a ceramic mug to my lips and took a long, slow sip of strong, unpoisoned black coffee, savoring the clean taste. I had legally instructed Mitchell to set up a massive, completely anonymous trust fund, specifically for little Tommy, ensuring the boy would be fully provided for when he turned 18. A young child is never to blame for the horrific, selfish sins of his mother. I had permanently severed every single tie with the smoldering wreckage left behind in Dallas. I was wealthy, healthy, and for the first time in a very long time, I was completely, undeniably free. Blood makes you related, but loyalty and respect are what make you family. When you spend your entire life providing for others, it is incredibly easy to mistake their toxic dependence for genuine love. Never let your boundless generosity become a dangerous weapon used directly against you. Trust your instincts, If something feels wrong in your own home, it usually is. True strength is not merely about building a financial empire for your ungrateful children. It is having the absolute courage to aggressively tear it down when they betray you. You cannot buy character, but you can protect your peace. Have you ever trusted someone who turned out to be a wolf wearing sheep clothing? How did you take your power back? Drop your own personal story in the comments down below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of justice, betrayal, and revenge.